Well, dear friends, ladies and gentlemen, benvinguts. My name is Ignacio Peiro. I am the director of Instituto Cervantes in London. And it is my pleasure to welcome you to our third Joanot Martorell lecture on Catalan literature. As many of you know, this annual lecture, held every December since 2019, is a joint venture between the Catalan Center at Queen Mary University and the Instituto Cervantes. So first of all, I would really like to thank Professor John London, the director of the Catalan Center, for his support, his ideas, and his enthusiasm. I'm afraid this is my last year in London and therefore my last Martorell lecture, and I wanted to express in public my admiration for his scholarship and also for the brilliant work he is doing expanding knowledge about Catalan language and literature, which, however stunning it may seem, is only one of his many interests as a researcher. Muchas gracias, John, moltes gracias. And before I leave next September, let's try to work on the next talk. I will leave the floor to John London to introduce our speaker, Professor Robert Bob Davidson. But before that, I would like to say special thanks to our guest this evening. Bob, we're honored to have you with us. I know you have a very, very tight schedule, and we really appreciate your availability as well as your commitment with this talk since we first approached you a few months ago. I think since this series of talks started a couple of years ago, we have gathered some of the most knowledgeable experts in Catalan literature. We had Joan Luis Marfany last year and Jordi Amat in 2019. So we badly needed you on board, for which again, many thanks. And also for coming up with a subject that brings Verdaguer's eternal Canigó to the latest literary trends. So I will leave the floor now to John London, who will also be in charge of reading your questions to the speaker at the end of the talk. But I will finish with a wish, which is for the continuity of this beautiful initiative called the Joanot Martorell Lecture. I hope you have a very inspiring evening. Muchas gracias, moltes gracias a tothom. Thanks.
Thank you, Ignacio. And we will be sorry to see you go. It's been very sweet for you to thank me, but really it's a mutual. Before this becomes a love-in, this was an initiative we started 3 years ago, more than 3 years ago, and it is concentrated on literature. It's called the Joanot Martorell Lecture. If you don't know who Joanot Martorell is, he is the author of Tirant Blanc, and we thought that was a suitable name, not because Joanot Martorell is going to give us a lot of money, unfortunately, but because, in other words, it's not a sponsor, but because if you know anything about that novel, some would consider the first novel in European literature, there is a strong English element in it. So that would be an ideal bridge, really, for the name of a lecture. My name is John London. As Ignacio has said, I'm the director for the Centre for Catalan Studies, Queen Mary, University of London. In the chat, I'm putting the address that we have online. Please, if you want to tweet during the lecture, go ahead, because you'll find the address, Instagram as well, Facebook as well, on that page. You're most welcome to, as well as putting your questions as we go along, if you want, into the chat. That's how it will work, and then we'll read them and see what the response is for the discussion afterwards. Let me introduce then our speaker, Professor Robert Davidson, Professor of Spanish and Catalan Studies at the University of Toronto. I want to say bon vespre, good evening to everybody, but it's good afternoon to you, and good afternoon to everybody to the west and further into the evening for those to the east. So that's another thing we have to thank you for, because the atmosphere will be slightly different. Robert Davidson is the author of Jazz Age Barcelona, a really successful academic book that takes us into that realm of the Jazz Age, but not in Paris, rather in Catalonia, in Barcelona. And for those of you who attended the concert we put on 2 years ago, last year, sorry, it should be said, by Luis Coloma, you will know something about the history of jazz in Catalonia. In fact, outside of Barcelona, which it really started from the evidence we have outside of Barcelona. But it's a beautiful book because Robert draws on photography, art, journalism, really, not just the usual sources that you would assume And remember, since Josephine Baker was honored yesterday by the French, it really is apposite to be reminded of jazz presence in other countries in Europe. Another book published by Professor Davidson is The Hotel, Occupied Space. Again, it's multidisciplinary, it's multi-generic. And gosh, if you think about The Hotel as Occupied Space, that was published in 2018. But think now of the people who have to stay in hotels for certain reasons, and you realize that a lot of what he says in that book becomes relevant in a rather different context when people have to self-isolate and are forced into hotels. The idea of it as a location for pleasure sort of disappears in that way. Professor Davidson is working on two projects. The one that concerns us here is one enticingly called The Scent of Spain, Fragrance, Odor, and Culture. And what he's going to say tonight is part of that big project. Some of you in the audience have a little file, P-H-I-A-L, of a smell. It should have come to you in this packet if you were following us on the page of the Centre for Catalan Studies and you're on our emailing list. You were offered this, and several of you have received this. Do not open it now. You will receive precise instructions from Professor Davidson as to when to open it. I say that with the obvious knowledge that it is giving off a smell already. Just try and put it in a position where it doesn't smell too much, because you're supposed to smell it at a strategic point in the lecture. So without further ado, remember the chat, be active on it with comments as well as we go along. I pass the screen on to Professor Davidson. Great pleasure, and thank you enormously for agreeing to do this.
Great. Thank you very much, John, for the wonderful introduction. Thank you to Ignacio for your very kind words. It's a real honor to give the Joan Martorell annual lecture and to be back at Queen Mary again. It's been a few years since I was there. I guess Jordi was the director the last time I was there. And I'd like to thank everyone in the audience too for taking the time at the end of what I know has been a really challenging semester, taking the time to listen to my work. I will endeavor to keep to the spirit of the golden rule of keynote or invited lecture: don't be boring. To begin with, though, given that this is a talk about stories and land, I would be remiss if I didn't acknowledge that the place from which I am delivering this lecture is within the traditional territories of Indigenous peoples. As a meeting place of many nations, Toronto is encompassed by the Dish with One Spoon Treaty. This agreement between the Anishinaabe, Mississaugas, and Haudenosaunee committed them to share the territory and protect the land. Subsequent Indigenous nations and peoples, Europeans, and all newcomers are part of this treaty in the spirit of peace, friendship, and respect. My talk today is about Azarine van der Vliet Olumi's PEN Faulkner Award-winning novel, Call Me Zebra, one of the most Catalan novels, I would hazard to say, ever written by a non-Catalan, not in Catalan. It's a story of an attempted exilic return. And while it draws on Don Quixote, the Inferno, and the Odyssey, at its core, it is a metatextual and intensely Catalan book that privileges key sites of Catalonia's modern literature. Within the pantheon of classics that the author engages through a series of spatio-literary pilgrimages undertaken by her protagonist, one stands out: Jacint Verdaguer's Canigó. I argue that the epic poem, and especially the eponymous mountain that inspired it, occupy a special place in the novel by literally grounding the protagonist in symbolically Catalan space and providing the exile with a new sense of pertinence or belonging. To anticipate my conclusion, a full exilic return is aborted when the protagonist is able to resuscitate herself metaphorically through a physical experience of the place of literature and a subsequent return to affective life. So how is it that a key Renaixença work figures so centrally in a 21st century novel? I will suggest that Call Me Zebra's genesis in Excursionism, rambling or hiking, echoes that of the epic poem in a very deliberate way that not only underlines the symbolic importance of Canigó, but also contributes to a renewed trend towards a physical, mobile, and as we shall see, even olfactive experience of the Catalan landscape as a recuperative mode. Now, what do I mean by this? as part of what I'm doing by examining the links between this novel and poem, I want to expand on the sort of commonplace reading of Renaixença works as restoratives that are effectively locked in time or trapped in amber, and point to the way that they, and Berlaguet's epic poem in particular, can continue to resonate and offer new readings. And I think that Call Me Zebra is a perfect example of this. And I propose that its intense focus on mobility and land, which begins with involuntary travel, dust, dirt, and residue, and evolves to an exceptionally place-based engagement with an adopted landscape through planned excursions, is redolent of sensorial shifts in Catalan's relationship with their natural surroundings. And this is a dynamic that I've previously signaled as regards taste through invocations of terroir and the regulatory regimes of denominations of origin. Today, I'll push that even further into the realm of smell when, in the last part of this lecture, I point to the olfactory excursionism of Brava Nariz perfumer Ernesto Collado in a scent-based reading of some passages of Canigó that will then bring us full circle. But first, Call Me Zebra. I'm going to give a brief overview of the story for those of you who haven't read it yet, and then focus on the protagonist's initial moment of trauma before moving to the story's climax, where she has her literature-based reckoning on the Canigó mountain. Imagine that you are the child of a long line of autodidactic atheist anarchists, that you pick up languages the way some people pick up viruses, and that as a result of your family's extensive library, you face life armed with literature. Now consider that you are also fated to be in exile, and soon you will be the only one of your line left, the mental bearer of your father's manifesto on historical time, and the porter of the few relics that tie you materially to the past. Your family's journey to safety takes you from the Caspian Sea to the northwest of Iran, where, in a bombed out village, your mother dies tragically. In an act that will resonate throughout your life, you bury her with your own two hands. Then it's into Turkey, on to Spain, and finally to America. When your father eventually passes away from old age in New York, you will rebaptize yourself Zebra and begin what you call your grand tour of exile. This is the buildup of the lion's share of van der Vliet Alumi's engaging and award-winning novel from 2018, an affecting yet by turns absurdist story of a traumatized Iranian woman's quest to enter what she calls the void of exile and trace her family's path in reverse. The narrative is intimately informed by literature and its practices and draws on the DNA of Western classics, such as those that I mentioned earlier. That the Catalan cultural landscape and the connection between literature and geography should figure so fundamentally as both actual and metaphoric sites of reckoning and recuperation is both highly intriguing and important. Van der Vliet Alumi's multifaceted approach to mourning productively ties together the narrator's physical experience of the land as earth, dirt, dust, and locale, and literature's potential as a matrix for life. This literal and figurative manifestation of terrain writ large in letters is one founded in both physical and intellectual excursionism, which I'll return to shortly. Now, it must be said that Call Me Zebra is a book that challenges the reader as it works towards its multifaceted goal of resuscitation, the resuscitation of self to a sense of pertinence and of narrative. And I have a reading group of former students from a first-year seminar. We've been meeting for a few years, and I gave them this book to read, and they read it, and they're like, "Sir," like, because we'd read Don Quixote together, and then they said, "Sir, this book is like, it's heavy, right? Like, what's going on?" And the lead character, the protagonist, she's so unlikable, right? And I'm like, "Well, why do you think she might, like, what's going on?" They're like, "Oh, she's always pushing us away." And they kind of twigged onto the fact that, oh, maybe she has some trauma, maybe she's depressed, right? And so not only is this protagonist, Bibi cum Zebra, an intellectual who has clearly chosen introspection over a life of expansive relationships, but the work's heavy reliance on metaphors of archiving, memorization, and collecting, not to mention its somewhat gonzo, in the Hunter S. Thompson sense, use of interjections and citations, create a barrier of codes that at first seems pretty daunting. But through the novel's fruitful deployment of repetition, though, these ciphers become progressively more legible. And in this way, the reader comes to understand that the first-person narrative of Call Me Zebra tracks the working out of the Iranian American's protagonist's own trauma and her slow progression towards a resolution of all things, Catalonia and its literary history. The novel's deep dive into Catalan literature and culture is what moves me to extol it as one of the most Catalan books by a non-Catalan. The story proper begins with 1980s Iran-Iraq War, during which the protagonist's family takes refuge north of Tehran in an ancestral stone house. The girl, who will later baptize herself Zebra in an act of self-naming that invokes Alonso Quijano's transformation into Don Quixote and metatextually emulates the black and white of a text on a page, is born in the home's egg-shaped library, the so-called oasis of books, with a date palm in the center. Van der Vliet de Lumy's description of the scene is evocative. And I quote, "My mother leaned against the trunk of the tree and pushed. I, a gray-faced, black-eyed baby, slipped from her loins into a room lined with dusty tomes, into a country seized by war. I immediately popped a date in my mouth to sweeten the blow. I learned to crawl, walk, read, write, shit, and eat in that library. Even before I could read, I nurtured my brain by running my hands along the spines of all the old books and licking their soot off my fingers, feeding on the dust of literature." End quote. The mix of birth, dust, and learning is a heady one. The oasis metaphor and her pre-literate ingesting of the symbolic residue of and on literature reinforces the inherent connection to books that Zebra feels and needs. This association will become even more potent 2 pages and 5 years later, when the family is forced to move again and her mother is killed, crushed by falling debris in a dilapidated house while searching for food. This tragic occurrence becomes subconscious fuel for the rest of the novel. While her anguished father is resigned to leaving his wife buried in rubble, 5-year-old Zebra insists that they disinter her and then bury the body properly. The symptoms from this traumatic event will haunt her throughout her life and only be resolved years later on the slopes of the Canigó mountain. This terrible and obscene connection to earth while experiencing displacement marks her. This gin is good today. Call Me Zebra is a novel that not only uses literature as a critical approach, but actively champions it in the elaboration of its particular history. In her family's manifesto, the first commandment says, quote, "to trust nobody and love nothing except literature, the only magnanimous host that there is in this decaying world." While the third directive points squarely at literary criticism. We Hosseinis, autodidacts, anarchists, atheists, are expert connoisseurs of literature and therefore capable of taking a narrative apart and putting it back together faster than a wounded man can say, ah. Especially moving here is Zebra's first mention of her mother's death and how she connects it to the manifesto her father recites. Quote, "Suffice it to say that in combination with the events that unfurled during my childhood years, events charged with everything that is futile and unspeakable in this universe, my father's monologue transformed my consciousness. I had not been alive long before my mother, Bibi Khanum, died. Her death flattened my heart into a sheet of paper. It leveled my mind. It rubbed my nose in manure." This extremely suggestive literary metaphor for the traumatic moment sets up a powerful connection between symptom and reading writing on the symbolic sheet of paper that now resides at her affective core. At the same time, the reference to manure brings a baser, more pungent element. Zebra orients her explorations of the void of exile, both outwards, geographically, and inwards, where, as the narrative signals, trauma affects the generative elements of life, of a life that we already know is and will be based in literature. That it is also inflected by the earth's humus and residue, the affinities that sensation and experience of place afford, is an element that she will learn. The fact that she experiences recurring somatic symptoms as well reminds the reader of one of the other ways in which trauma can manifest, and further links the emotional terrain that the novel covers with the geographic and physical. The death of the mother also introduces a profound cognitive instability. Consider the similarities to the description of the narrator's own birth, along with the repetition of the dust and the date palm in this quotation of the death of her mom. Her face was flat and gray. It was covered in dust. Once I had seen it, I couldn't unsee it. Her face had introduced a distortion in my visual field. The world seemed unstable at the edges. Hours later, Breathless and confused, we buried my mother beneath a lone date palm. Our fingers were numb from clawing at the earth. The aching of her digits will become a recurring physical symptom throughout Zebra's life, a painful residual possession by an image that she cannot comprehend. Her mother's cold corpse is transposed to the daughter's living body as a latent somatic memory rooted in the traumatic aftermath of her mother's death. And we can also see this as, sort of fertile ground for close reading in the multiple rich meanings of date and palm, blending together time of birth, the time of death, and the pain she feels in her hands. So this then is the traumatic beginning, the encoding of the protagonist's relationship to literature and pain and self through rubble and earth as she's displaced and experiencing forced mobility. Resuscitation will come for her, but it will arrive through an adopted home, its concomitant landscape, and her travels through it. As the novel progresses, Zebra participates with the world beyond herself in different ways. And it is here that the novel's engagement with Catalanitat and the manner in which many of Catalonia's modern writers and thinkers were influenced by the literal terrain that surrounded them emerges. Following a stay in Barcelona, where she reconnects with the city and has access to the library of a character named Quim Monzó, not that Quim Monzó apparently, even though that Quim Monzó does blurb the novel on the back. The plot takes her after Barcelona. The plot takes her to Girona, from which she will strike out to other places in the Empordà and the Alt Empordà. One of the first locales that she visits is the tiny town of Albanyà, where she goes to fast and commune with nature. While her process of mourning may have begun to turn her towards the world, she is neither prepared for nor accustomed to the emotional labor required to sustain relationships. Things are going poorly with the love interest. Instead, she reflects deeply on both Walter Benjamin's grim fate not far away in the border town of Portbou and his formative statement that, quote, even the most perfect reproduction of a work of art is lacking in one element, its presence in time and place, its unique existence at the place where it happens to be. Zebra's subsequent so-called Socratic dialogue with the environment leads to the revelation that by changing reproduction to retranscription, she could join literary practice and terrain. Quote, suddenly all was clear. Displaced transcriptions would no longer do. I had to retranscribe Josep Pla's literature in the places and spaces represented within its pages, namely Girona and Palafrugell, Joan Maragall's in Barcelona, Walter Benjamin's in Portbou, Jacint Verdaguer on a hike to the peak of the Canigó. Not only would this strategy connect her even more with her father's exilic path, but it would also hopefully raise the consciousness of any non-exiles she may encounter or take on her pilgrimages. For the protagonist, quote, the landscape, as far as I'm concerned, has become my library, an archive that lays bare the subtext of time, the tangled meanings I need to excavate. By submerging herself in literature's radical genealogy and at the same time exhuming the corpse of the past, she's returning to the world in the only way that she knows. And now here we think, is the corpse her mother? We can think of the parallels of reading the landscape and rereading the text as a landscape, the landscape as a text. Van der Vliet Ulumi is challenging us to put pressure on this intimate, embodied connection. And of course, here one sees the important overlap of Zebra's movements in the story world, the 19th century peregrinations of Verdaguer, and those of the author Van der Vliet Ulumi in the 21st century. Excursionistas all drawn in by the Catalan landscape. Now I will start to share my screen. Hopefully this works. Okay. As de Salas et al. Point out, quote, to hike in the landscape means to establish a relationship of thoughts and sensations with that landscape, resulting in an intuitive mental representation that is derived from the knowledge and experience of the observer. The act of walking is as ancient as humanity itself. However, the motivations for walking in and amongst landscapes have changed through the centuries, fundamentally related to the evolution of society. So the act of walking is intrinsic, right, to human history. Men and women have hiked in the landscape to look for food, to make pilgrimages, for trade and business purposes, as well as for tourism. and recreation related to health. As an organized activity, excursionism in Europe has been connected as well to philosophies of nature and scientific inquiry since the 18th century. In Catalonia, excursionism grew out of the Renaixença desire to know one's own land, a consolidation through physical experience of the modern imagining of Catalonia happening on linguistic, historiographic, and especially literary fronts. While the Principat of Girona was the initial hub, once the medieval walls around Barcelona were demolished and the need to return to the city at a given time was eliminated, interest in excursionism by those in the capital increased substantially. The most famous literary work connected to hiking the Catalan countryside is, of course, Jacint Verdaguer's epic poem, Canigó. For those in the audience who may not be Catalan literature people, what are you doing with your life? It's not too late to change. Verdaguer was born in 1845 in the town of Folgueroles, which is located on the plain of Vic. He has been called the Prince of Catalan Poets, and my favorite, a rebel priest. He was ordained at the age of 25. Health issues saw him first visit the Roussillon, when perhaps he saw the Canigó mountain for the first time, before taking a job as a chaplain for a transatlantic steamship company, which was owned by Antonio López, who obviously has been part of this reassessment, right, of the building of Barcelona with money that comes from the slave trade. And so he traveled to Havana. He finished his first epic poem, Atlántida, on the return journey in 1876. And from then on, his reputation as a poet grew. While his great Catalan epic, Canigó, was published in 1886, during the summers of 1882 and 1883, he traversed the Pyrenees from the Canigó to the Aneto, exploring the valleys, forests, and peaks, all the while documenting his journey in notebooks. And for those who are interested in the nitty-gritty of this period or the gestation of the poem, I highly recommend Narcís Garolera and Kurt Whitland, who used to teach, I think he must be emeritus now at Saskatchewan, their annotated and illustrated book of those notebooks. Then, in the summer of 1884, he spent a month and a half at the Mare de Déu del Mont sanctuary to complete his poem in a place where he could contemplate the snow-capped peaks in more relative comfort. The name of the town where the sanctuary is located, Albanyà. The protagonist of Call Me Zebra literally follows in Verdaguer's footsteps. And I found this, at first I thought you could rent this, but no, it's a museum. But here is Verdaguer's bedroom, which is now he could sort of see and write from the window. Call Me Zebra, too, is a book inspired by travels through Catalonia. And while the archive of Verdaguer's groundwork resides in the Biblioteca de Catalunya, that of van der Vliet Olumies is a tad more modern. In blog posts that she made on the Words Without Border website in 2012, one can find travelogue notes from the Fulbright-funded research trip that would eventually inform the Catalan parts of her novel. What is more, in the introduction to the series of posts, the author makes some very succinct observations that rehearse connections with the rebel priest, and which are especially apropos today's lecture. Quote, "The synergy between journey, literature, and landscape is strong, and Catalan writers, both ancient and contemporary, continually put the strength of this relationship in evidence. For example, Joanot Martorell's famous 15th century chivalric romance, Tirant Blanc, features a protagonist who travels, as John said earlier, from England to Constantinople through the larger Mediterranean and draws into relief the landscape's breadth and variety. With a more focused eye on specific aspects of the Catalan landscape, 19th century poet and practicing priest, Jacint Verdaguer, frequently traveled to the Canigó mountain to get inspiration for his epic poem, Canigó." I find the explicit mention of Verdaguer here especially noteworthy, considering his presence in the novel as both a canonical author that Zebra seeks to understand and as a metatextual influence and model for the author's creative process. Additionally, the concept of a pilgrimage also fits well given the poet's clerical vocation and Zebra's self-declared status as a pilgrim of the void. Excursionism dominates the last phase of Call Me Zebra. The protagonist assembles a ragtag group of hikers under the banner of the Bureau of Spatial Literary Investigations, and then leads them on her various pilgrimages of exile. The initial pair of trips are called the Pilgrimage of the Memory Man and dedicated to Josep Pla, first in Girona and then in Palafrugell. The next is that of the Wide-Eyed Genius, her moniker for the iconoclast Dalí, followed by a solo one to Portbou to confront the site of Benjamin's suicide before embarking on what she calls the Pilgrimage of the Catalan Resuscitator, the climactic trip to the summit of Canigó. This mountain, which so transfixed and inspired Verdaguer, is located on the French side of the Pyrenees, less than 50 kilometers from the sea. It stands, you can see where it is in relationship to Barcelona too in the first part. It stands almost 2,800 meters tall and is part of a dramatic, often snow-capped massif that is visible from Roussillon in France and the Empordà on the Catalan side. The summit is adorned with a large metal cross, and given its location between Nord and Sud, the mountain as a whole has a special resonance for Catalans. On Saint Joan, the Flama del Canigó serves as a sort of bonfire for those in the Països who celebrate Midsummer's Eve with fire. And these pictures, I thank my colleague Rosie Song and friend Fernanda de Alba for sharing. I haven't climbed up it, but they have, and so I'm taking advantage of their hard work. Okay. In Verdaguer's well-known words, Lo Canigó es una magnolia inmensa, que en un rebrot del Pirineu cebada per abelles tefadas que la volten, per papallons los cisnes i les àligues, formen son calze escarides serres, que plateja l'hivern i l'estiu d'aura, grandiós veire on veu olors l'estrella, los aires relentor, los núvols, aigua, les boscúries de pins són los pardissos, los estanyols les gotes de rosada, i és son pistil aqueix palau aurífic, somni de loja que del cel davalla. For Zebra and her pilgrims who have accompanied her en route to Saint-Michel-de-Couchet on the French side of the border, the Canigó ahead of them appears as a gorgeous beast, with something violent about its mass of elongated rocks, the snow-capped summit, the alpine forest that grew out of its flanks and passes. Their progress is slow, and as the weather begins to worsen, she remembers a previous visit that, with her father for San Juan, when they kept vigil with strangers through the night and lit torches on the fire. They did so, she says, quote, not in the spirit of Catholicism, but in the spirit of Catalan identity, end quote. Back in the present, she looks forward into the future of her past that they were approaching. She sees abrupt cliffs, ravines, slender cascades rippling into small pools, twisted strata of crystalline rocks amidst, quote, a crisscrossing labyrinth of sierras, massifs, separated by bright valleys and shallow glaciers. To try to lift the mood of her pilgrim, Zebra recites verses from Verdaguer's Canigó that her father had repeated and taught her, but not even the famous immense magnolia line can buoy them. Then, there on the symbolic mountain, amidst ever worsening weather, Zebra has her literature and landscape informed reckoning. She resists the elements and exhortations to go back down as her hands ache in one final somatic reminder of her mother's death. What, she wonders, would have been the last thing she saw before she died? Did she swallow the dirt of the world, she asks? Well, herself grabbing a chunk of mud and eating it. This macabre repetition of the death of her mother, her appropriation of the muteness of the dead, triggers a lost maternal logos. Throughout the novel, she's been unable to remember anything that her mother ever told her. But now a quote whispered to her as a child comes back, providing her some peace and managing to partially restore coherence to the narrative of her exilic life by allowing her to accept her place in the void. This resuscitation, the psychic reuniting of the paternal and maternal in Catalonia's most symbolic natural space, in turn informs her decision to halt her grand tour of exile as a knight of the void, and instead follow her love interest Ludo Bembo at the very end of the book. Just as Verdaguer's poem weaves the history and geography of people, and in so doing transcends time and space, so too does Van der Vliet Alumi's narrative of displacement and trauma find a way to borrow from an adoptive tradition so as to resuscitate her character and give her new ground. Like Gentil, who abandons the battle for the love of a fairy, the night zebra shoulders arms when she is once again able to love. So to return to my initial question, how should we interpret the fact that Canigó occupies such an important role in this powerful 21st century novel? First, I believe that by weaving the exilic experience of the other into the modern firmament of Catalan letters, the author is making a very optimistic statement regarding pertinence and belonging and how and to whom the canon belongs. And this is something that Jaume Subirana has explored in his fine book, Construir con Palabras. Second, I think that the choice of Verdaguer as the novel's guide wire in terms of process really does push us to examine more deeply what such a strong emphasis on landscape and place and experience can entail or mean at different levels. And here I'm talking about the fact that both the poet and the novelist represent or communicate or try to communicate embodied knowledge. Call Me Zebra is a call to read and interpret in situ, and its clear connection to the genesis and setting of Canigó underlines both the generative powers of mobility that lies at the heart of Excursionism on the one hand, and the sensorial potentiality of landscape and place to add more to our understanding on the other. Of course, Canigó is primarily a story set in the 11th century that mixes history and myth, but it's also very much about nature and the specific environment of that place. It is about rocks and rivers, and it is about the flora. It is about connecting the 11th century with 1886 through language, history, and space. And by extension, we see how the 19th and 21st centuries can intersect with different parameters. We travel in time thanks to the persistence of place. Another way that we can travel in both time and space is through our senses. The slippery concept of terroir supposes that the essential character of a product can be transcendental, that it can surpass its place and communicate itself beyond the borders of the environment and cultivation that engendered it. In a similar fashion, smell is incredibly powerful, and we still don't know exactly how it works. That it is connected to emotions and memory is unquestionable, though. And likewise, when scent augments our experience of something, we know it. So with this in mind, I'd like to conclude by drawing us back around to the act of walking in the landscape. But this time we're going to read a little differently. Remember that I quoted Salas: to hike in the landscape means to establish a relationship of thoughts and sensations with that landscape, resulting in an intuitive mental representation. What if we could feel part of those sensations? What if our mental representation could be augmented by the presence of molecules that produce the scent of that land? Because if the molecules are in our nose, helping to create scent in concert with our brain, are we not there in some way? This is a slide. Only when we have understood and captured the aromatic soul of a landscape, we begin to formulate its perfume. That is why our bottles not only contain the essence of a place, but of all experiences lived in it. I propose that a bridge to this possibility exists, at least in our case of the Canigó and its surroundings today, in the compelling work that perfumer Ernesto Collado is doing with his team at Brava Nariz in the Empordà. In their manifesto, they respond to the question, how to be nature, and propose a new way of relating to nature through smell. The forests are full of olfactory voices that affect and transform us, they say. Their drive is to capture those aromas and put them in a bottle, not to study them, but be able to speak the language of plants. Here, this idea of formulating the experience prior to the perfume encompasses everything we do until we call a literal olfactory reference of the landscape that we want to capture, and includes the manual collection of the plants in their own environment, following our exclusive sustainable wild harvest protocol. The distillation and creation of the olfactory capture and the subsequent comparison of this with the reference landscape. Now, this is what John mentioned earlier. This is the Muga by Brava Nariz. You can see these are the main accords: herbal, aromatic, fresh, spicy, woody, sweet. I get a lot of sweet off this. We'll all smell things slightly different. If you put it on your skin, of course, it'll be different. And here is the blurb written for this. Muga is dynamic and ever-changeable, intense and nearly impertinent, like spring. You can hear the buzzing of bees and sense the silent sexuality of rosemary, immortelle, thyme, and lavender. Muga is the name of the river that crosses the Alta Empordà, connecting the mountains with the sea. The river plays the role of matchmaker in this strange marriage between two opposing worlds. They say it used the exuberance of spring to bring them together, and the river's fertile waters helped unleash their affair. Spring enlivens us. Rosemary and immortelle raise our spirits, and cypress is a powerful and well-known antidepressant. We ask ourselves why they are planted in cemeteries. To compensate for all that enthusiasm, chamomile and Spanish lavender add a dash of serenity, and the familiar elegance of lavender takes you by the hand and reassures you. Some of the people who've seen sort of me trying out some of this new research with Agua Brava and Agua Lavanda have had the chance to smell these here in Toronto. If you drop by my office anytime, I'll put you on that sort of olfactory path. So if you have a sample of Muga, please spray it on a tester or your skin and breathe it in as I read some verses from the poem that so inspired Van der Vliet Ulumi. And just a tip, if you're smelling different fragrances, the best way to reset your nose is to smell yourself. Not so much coffee like in duty frees, because a lot of perfumes and colognes have coffee accords or notes, right? So let it go, and then we'll talk about what you smell afterwards. I'm just going to read a few things. Coliran afaldadas las doncellas, pasos, dolor, violas y grosellas. Maidens have fetched and ferried in their aprons violets, poppies, and fragrant sweet pea. And these are all translations from the magnificent translation that Ronald Pupo did of Canigó. And then from the first cant, the San Juan bouquet, un ramellet cuida flors, millor ventura no trova, floretas de San Juan, de Romaní y Farigola, y amb elles fent una creu del mas la guinda en corona. Rosemary, thyme, fragrant herbs, right? From the cant tercer, the enchantment, lliris d'aigua, nevats i meravelles, les ofreixen gots d'olor suau. Semblen pures i efèmeres estrelles que hi deixà caure aquest matí el cel blau. And then a little further on, un d'ells al cim de Canigó encamina per Viarany rivetejat de flors, que al pujar-hi la fada llur regina aboquen a sos peus tots sos olors. The Canigó is a poem that's full of nature's smells, fragrant herbs, and many, many blossoms that create almost a literary living flower or headspace that we can access. This is the sort of technical term for the emanations from plants and flowers. Roses don't necessarily smell. If you take a piece of rose, it doesn't smell like a rose. The rose smell comes from the emanations from the flower. The famous chorus of the fairies as they dance the sardana in the sixth canto is a memorable example of this. And this is usually the verses that everyone knows. Montañas regaladas son las de Canigó. Ellas tot l'any floreixen, primavera y tardor. And finally, back to cant segon, Flor de Neu, and my favorite verses from the poem, which create an olfactory image that I think is simply remarkable. Ella, a mirar l'ocel, gentil sa cara, olor de romaní dels boscos puja, dels cims olor de regalèsia baixa. Thank you very much for your presence today and taking the time to listen to me. I really appreciate it. Thanks.
If you want to unmute, if you can have the applause. We can get back to screen. Do you want to stop sharing, Robert?
Sure. I think I did, no?
You did? Not. You're still the screen's still showing, but doesn't you're frozen. I don't know if that's mine. Yeah, okay, no, you're back there. That's fine.
Okay.
Fantastic. Fantastic. If you want to put any emoji sign for applause, if you have been muted, please do. That was extremely enjoyable. We're still smelling, and you can see the chat. I hope people are commenting.
Oh yeah.
People are commenting on what the smell is. Okay, thanks Rita and Tabitha. And they're trying to define it. So I'm getting lavender at the end,
yeah, right.
as well as that mixture that you have here. The I don't know if the cypress, perhaps the lavender. The ones we're more familiar with here: rosemary, thyme, lavender. Any comments put in, just because it's just one or two words you can put in to see what. Yeah, people are saying really strong lavender there.
Okay.
So as we continue to that, according to our own body odors, definitely improving the atmosphere here in London, and preventing the stink of politicians perhaps intruding into certain universities. I'd like to start off before reading some of the comments and the questions that we've got, taking this privilege. I have to confess, I wasn't as enthusiastic about the novel as you are, and the reason is the following. But you're convincing me to go into the opposite direction. It really seemed with this dominance of Benjamin on the one hand, and on the other, it was a bit like either Benjamin or Borges had tried to write a novel, because Benjamin and Borges, for their essayistic genre, are successful and even moving on occasion. Perhaps Benjamin more than Borges, but this being saturated by literature really does distance and really fill out the emotion, because it all becomes literary essentially.
Yeah.
In a way that actually, I'm sorry, for me, descended into quite a young author really showing off about certain things that that had been read actually. But when the way you're conveying it is convincing me of the opposite, and especially, of course, interesting there that it becomes, it's Catalan, and who would choose, as you said, who would choose Catalan for a modern author, 21st century author, to base so much on that and go through those steps. It's not Graham Greene, retreading the steps of the Quixote or anything. It's a young author and doing this through, a 19th century author really unknown often in Spain, although it has to be said that Verdaguer was praised by somebody such as Méndez Pelayo, whose comments were even reprinted during Francoism, quite interestingly, in the 1940s, which is astounding when you think about it. But he was accepted, and he really was the person to be accepted above all else, above every other author, really, in those early Francoist years.
I'm sure his being a priest didn't hurt that.
Yep.
Right.
A tragic one as that, but yes.
Yeah.
I'm just wondering, though, the question would be, and what you've sort of skirted around, this is, as you've said, it's the 11th century to the 1880s, and it's inventing a myth, reinventing a myth, the myth of the foundation of Catalonia. And of course, it is the national myth that reunites French and Spanish Catalonia, takes us back to when it was all one area, and forms a central pillar of nationalism. Now, how does that mean anything to Van der Vliet-Delumi?
Pardon me, sorry?
Van der Vliet.
Oh, Van der Vliet-Delumi.
Does it mean anything to her?
I think that's a great question, right? And I think that less so, I would say less so than the process, and that's why originally I started pushing that, and that's why I think what she finds the most compelling here, because a lot of the Verdaguer is actually under the surface, right? Like the Albania is not mentioned. You have to sort of know, right? It's really not as determined as some of the other parts, right? Especially with the Benjamin. And so there is that level of overdetermination. There's also, I didn't go into it, but there's like the trauma theory here is Kathy Carruth, right? And I remember asking someone, I'm like, wow, this sounds like Kathy Carruth. And one of my colleagues said, well, yeah, she studied with her at Cornell when she was there for a semester. And I'm like, I knew it. But it really is a book. Like, we are the ideal audience for this book, right? Being Catalanists and Catalan scholars, it is something that, and the fact that it won the Penn Faulkner, I found, like, as I told you, I like the book, but I think, wow, is it really that accessible? How does this work, to an American audience, right, in the 21st century? I think the part about the actual myth and the sort of the roots of, sort of this roots of nationalism means less than the experience of the landscape, the process, and setting up for the canon to be examined, right? And this is the part where I choose also to be optimistic and say, okay, she's playing with the canon. She's activating it in ways that would anyone expect an Iranian American writer to do, right? And I find it kind of thrilling. And but at the same time, we can tell that there's critical theory here. And what does critical theory do with nationalism these days? Well, not very much, right? And so how do those two worlds respond and react? I think that it's there as the nationalist element that you mentioned is there as thickness, but I don't think that it's not meant to be spooled out.
Yeah, I'm just, my fear is that then it becomes, because of this danger or the fear
Of folklore.
Exactly, that it becomes a local color, that you can dilute your own emotions to and then associate, as opposed to the actual appreciation.
Yeah, but at the same time, she does go to pains to, like, her love of Catalonia comes from the father's library. So we have this sort of trope of the library of the father that she sort of inherits and then finds through this sort of by returning to the literary space of the Eixample, right, and renting this apartment, she has like fever dreams. This book is wild, right? And then at the end, by invoking the father and her up on the mountain, separating it from the religiosity, and instead, distinctly saying they're there for Catalan identity. She doesn't go into a deeper meaning of, is this a pan països, or is this like sort of, central, like sort of Catalan stateless nation Catalonia? But she does say it. And then I find it compelling, the fact that she has the sort of reconciliation or that recuperation of the mother's voice with the father's library, right? So these two forms of logos that happen. And that is really what allows her then to act like Gentil, right? And leave the fray.
Good. Okay, we could go on, but let's read some of the comments. Tabitha Cranford, we've got lots of comments, by the way, on what the actual smell is. For those of you who have the smell that you can look at, we've got resin, pine tree. Maureen Pilar says different smell at first. Some Eli Vilar of the Centre for Catalan Studies says, I liked the smell at first and then felt it was too strong for me and changed my mood. Very powerful, amazing lecture. So that was that. It influenced the way of smelling. That somebody else, it smells so good. We've got a really strong lavender, Berenice says. Tabitha Cranford says, because of smells, as a non-Catalan comment from comparative literature, this is very Patrick Suskind, yeah?
Yeah. There are no bodies made, I don't think.
No, but yes.
There are no humans hurt in the creation of this scent, hopefully, right?
So, if we start talking about smells as well, we've got very smoky as well as sweet.
It's something though that, and this is something that like in the last, and I'll just sort of explain how I got into this. I've been working on taste, right? And planning to do some collaborative work with colleagues here at the Culinary Research Center at U of T. And of course, pandemic happens. And so all of that's out the window. And I started thinking, okay, well, I'm interested in this idea of subjective and objective ostensibly. How do we communicate like the taste to people through language? And then so I thought, oh, there must be something with smell too. So I started investigating perfumes, and then I just went down the rabbit hole, and my house started to fill up with perfumes, ordering scents. And when I got a bottle of Quorum from a discounter, I opened it up, and suddenly I was transported to Spain in the 80s and my exchange father in Valencia, who wore Quorum. And that sort of put me down that rabbit hole. The thing about scent, though, is it really is like learning a new language. We're not trained, right? We're trained to see, and to think visually and everything, but we're not trained to smell. But you can really train your nose over time. And a lot of people who've lost their sense of smell, either through COVID or through other things, have been able to reactivate their smell through essential oils, right? Some chefs that lose their sense of smell don't tell anyone and then work on that to try to get their scent back. I was just looking, I just noticed that great comment from James Chow Thomas about troubadour.
Let's read it for people who are not there. He says, much of the Catalan Excursionism of the late 19th century was concerned with exploring the linguistic and cultural borders with Occitania, a subject covered by Auguste Raffanelli in his exhaustive book, La Illusió Occitana. Does this author, does Ulumi, explore any of this link vis-a-vis the troubadours or Catars?
Not to my, I don't remember that in the book. No, but that's a great point. And just the diversity, right? And the sort of multifaceted nature of the interest in the people who are participating in Excursionism. It's really, it's a really fascinating topic. And that's one of the reasons I want to, bring it up again now as one of these things that, like I said, I think there's a tendency to look at the Renaixença kind of this trapped in amber, then can we please move on to Modernism, right? And do Dali or do Gaudí, and it's a lot more fun. But there's these actions, and the fact that Brava Nariz is out there doing these walking tours, teaching people, there's forest bathing in other parts of the world. People are trying to, I think there's this desire to reconnect with the landscape in a new way. And this way is one that's very sensuous, right? Although hopefully it didn't change your mood in a bad way, but this,
I'm just wondering.
I'm hungry now, John.
Well, I don't know. I'm just wondering because I just wonder if they've put something in that makes it disappear, so you need more of it because it's extremely expensive. But I'm being too materialist. We've got a great question from Guillaume Coulomb in Montero in Glasgow. I have a question about the reception of the novel in Catalonia. If I'm not wrong, it hasn't had a lot of impact. Isn't that the case? I haven't seen any article about it or review. Also, it hasn't been translated into Catalan, has it? This is a rather surprising, I'd say. Could you?
Not that I know of. That's a great point. Thanks, Guillaume. I'm also. I did a quick look and I didn't find anything. I'm not quite sure. Maybe it's just bad timing. Maybe I don't know. I would love to ask Jaume, right, about that and see what he has to say, just in the way that she uses this. Great.
Because it could be somewhere with a publisher somewhere, you just don't know.
Exactly.
But it's worth looking up. Yeah. Francisco has a question. Isn't the essence of a place and experiences conveyed by smell, perfume, as in Brava Nariz, similar to Zebra's books, in that you need to be there, present, to embody the knowledge and experience?
I think that's a great. Thanks, friend. That's a great question. I think that the embodiment, and this is the crux of it, right, is how to communicate. How do you communicate the sensation without training or without a repertoire, like without an archive at hand? But there are ways of evoking, and I think it's possible. There are ways to evoke through language, through illusion, right? To activate the smell centers in the brain, to activate taste. One of the, people always say, no, you can't. And then there's that old trick where you just imagine you're sitting on a beach, the sun's beating down, you've got your eyes closed, you reach into your glass, cold water, you pull out the lemon, you put it in your mouth and you suck on it. And you just instantly feel, just through those words, right, your mouth contracting from that. There is a power, I think we do have this sort of resonance. This is a question that I'm going to be, grappling with throughout the project, is how to communicate these smells. How does smell work? How do fragrances that are, sort of environmental compared to ones that are fine or functional? And then what's the end game there? That's one of the reasons I wanted to hand these out, right? Ideally, if we had been all together, near the end of the talk, everyone would have got a tester and we would have all smelled it together. But yeah.
I'm just wondering, surely you must be talking somewhere, lurking in the background as Proust and that idea of memory. Yeah. And
it's striking that if you read the Proust, there isn't much on the smell of it, right? And it's obviously that experience that evokes it. And this is that sort of involuntary response of memory. The scent memories that we have, because olfaction passes through the emotion center first. And that's how we have these scent memories that become locked, right? They're tied usually to emotions. Otherwise, we would be walking around in a constant state of grace. Oh, this smells like the metro this morning. This smells like my coffee. Not, oh, this smells like my grandmother's house, or something where we have that affective element to it. Yeah.
I mean, just think some of the people here studying, or most people perhaps know La Place del Diamant in Diamond Square. I mean, there you've got dead pigeons and pigeon poo that smells quite strongly.
You can smell it.
You haven't been ordering that. You haven't been ordering that for your house then to come through. No. Okay, right. I mean, so you're interested in nice and interesting evocative smells that
not necessarily. Not necessarily.
Okay. Sorry,
because I also have a pack of Ducados here.
Okay. Well, for some that could be nice, but yeah.
Well, and you know that, and then of course the functional fragrances. But you're right. There's pollution, right? The smell of diesel. These are all things that also mark time and space, right? You know, we can tell here in Ontario. In the early 2000s, they shut down the coal factories. And so we actually effectively stopped having smog days in Toronto. A huge change, right, into our experience of the air, right? And there's parts of the world, you go to Beijing or you go to Delhi, where you can't see and you can't smell because your olfaction has been affected so much by pollution. Yeah.
Sorry, let's get back to the chat.
Sure.
Rosie Song, having expanded from taste to smell, what do you think is more evocative, taste or smell? In terms of sense or past memory, how is sharing different in terms of taste and smell?
I think they're completely related, right? And you know this if you have a bad cold and you eat an amazing meal, you're not going to get it, right? Because of the I forget the word for the breathing and how we have the taste, and it's all connected. I think obviously, well, I know the thing is Rosie's going to remember something I ate that I said I would never forget because of the taste. But I think smell is definitely more evocative in this sense, but they're very tightly wound, tightly together. Yeah. Thank you.
Okay. Richard Huddleston, I think now in Barcelona, but having got his PhD from the Centre for Catalan Studies from Queen Mary this year, says, thank you for this fascinating talk and insight into smelling as travel. I wanted to slightly deviate from smell, but as you frame smell as a way of being there, I wonder how the Catalan language itself does that and whether you had considered looking further into that area. I asked because Rovira i Virgili goes on at length in an advertencia at the end of his only play, Nova Vida, to stress that it's not written in standard Catalan and there's a lot of corruption from Castilian. To an extent, he's responding to the three divisions that frame the Catalan language question during the Renaixença. And he says apologies for approaching this theatre angle.
Oh,
it's one of Josep Pixart's constant worries. He struggled.
What a fantastic question. You must be very proud of this student, John. Like this is really I mean, what a great way to think about it, right? And also to help kind of drive, like to crack open a little bit more our kind of laissez-faire, way of dealing with the Renaixença, right? And to think, okay, well, what does the linguistic, if we kind of break it down to smaller pieces, right? Or look at different works and where they're being presented, or where they're, how the pronunciation and the poetry is changing. I hadn't thought of that. That's a fantastic question. Thank you, Ricardo.
I mean,
do you have any ideas, John, on that?
No, I'm just thinking if you're traveling, you'd go and your project is the centre of Spain, not just Catalonia. So the idea of the traveling is going to be that linguistic. You're in a sort of Unamuno territory, really, aren't you? Or Josep Pla territory.
Pla territory. And this is something that Rosie also, when I was talking to Rosie about this, she brought this up, the idea that, well, certain parts of Spain, there's preferences for functional fragrances, right? When I'm thinking now of cleaning products, why does one area like pine and the other like lemon, right? And these are can be culturally specific.
Okay, so which ones? Tell us which ones like pine and which ones like lemon.
Rosie, she's, I'm wondering if I know that these divisions exist because different things get marketed in different places. John, I have to go do the research first, but it would be interesting to know if areas with mountains, right, or close access to that sort of I wonder if there's a connection then by bringing, because that's part of the idea of freshness, right? In the interior, you've got, here, Rosie says the UK is more citric, in the US more pine. The idea of bringing the outside in a clean, sort of sterile way, right? That's great. Cool.
Yeah, the citric can be just lavatory cleaner, really, can't it? That's the problem.
That's what I mean.
Yeah. Oh, right. Okay. Yeah.
Billions of dollars go into the research and marketing of these products, of getting a product that you will not recoil at, that you'll want to use, and that you'll want your bathroom to smell it.
What other examples then are you taking from the Catalan area for Catalan-speaking areas for smell?
Oh, for smell? Well, the first chapter will be on the Puig house, the House of Puig, and looking at, and this is what I find remarkable. So I started researching Puig, Merugia, and Gal, and Puig has ended up buying all of the other ones, and is now this multi-billion-dollar house that controls Comme des Garçons, Nina Ricci. But I've started off with Agua Lavanda, which the Puig group was sourcing ingredients from all around the world. Franco, at the end of the Civil War, Franco closes the borders. They can't get the ingredients for their perfumes and their colognes anymore, so they have to go local. And that's the birth of Agua Lavanda. They use it using lavender. And of course, Agua Lavanda then goes on to become sort of this very stereotypical, very sort of herb smell of the 20th century in not only in Catalonia, but across Spain, right? That lavender is also something that's coded culturally. Like lavender is refreshing, sort of, relaxing in different places. Lavender is it's sort of thought of in different ways in different places. And from there, I go to Agua Brava, the modernity of the bottles, and then up to Quorum, right? As this sort of sense comes out in 1981, the smell of democracy, right? This participation in, and what really also interests me is the aspirational aspect of scent. Puig, Spain was not the coolest kid on the block, right? In the 20th century, until later in the 20th century. The Puig group goes and gets Paco. They got Paco Rabanne into the fragrance world. He was this super cool French, futurist designer. And he becomes the one speaking for Puig, designing for Puig. Paco Rabanne, the green with the R on it, right? Very, very classic scent. They also got Carolina Herrera and Nina Ricci into the perfume world. So that's my main, sort of the main focus there will be on the Puig group and how the small Catalan house became sort of a worldwide player in fragrance, but began through almost like a very specific political aspect of terroir, of olfactory terroir.
Keep saying terroir. Shouldn't you be talking about wine and superb Catalan wine as
I
competition?
have a piece on
the
Cava
grapes
coming out, John. I have a piece on Cava coming out soon.
Okay, I was going to say, well, the Cava is one thing, but also the grapes used, of course, are different region to region.
Well, exactly.
Tempranillo doesn't tend to be used in Catalonia to the same extent.
Yeah, I have a chapter on the Priorat and the way that the concept of terroir actually damaged the landscape, because, as you know, right before the crisis, the economic crisis, every professional and their dog was getting into the Priorat wine, right? The garagist, and I'm not talking garagist, I'm talking, sort of architect, lawyers who want to get in. And what they did was supreme damage. And of course, the first thing that goes when the economic crash came was the sort of hobby winery, which then caused a massive erosion on the mountains in the Priorat. That is the Priorat is an incredible story of an area that went from the poorest, and just really making aguardiente, grapes for aguardiente and brandy, right? Sort of very stable things, the access quite close to the sea, right? But then, because of what happened in the rest of Spain and Robert Parker Jr. throwing a couple 95s on Priorat wines really changed the face of the land. Like that's where we see reviewers changing the actual physical space.
If anybody knows that film called The Barolo Boys about Barolo, that's a documentary, there's probably equivalent one to be done then for the Priorat, which would be, you should direct I think will be a good idea. Has anybody got any more comments? Because otherwise I'm going to start talking about the different grape varieties that I find more attractive, and it could be.
This is the problem why we can't do it in person. Like we're not in person, John. I'd love to.
Well, you do the tasting as well at the same
exactly.
time. Yeah, exactly.
I want if I can just thank everyone again. Thank you very much, John. Thank you, Ignacio, for allowing me giving me the honor of giving this lecture and also sharing my research, not this current research, but all of my research with everyone. And I see so many people I love in the audience here. It's really something. This is the great part of the job, right? Is being able to talk about what we do. So thank you very much.
Does anybody want to make? We've got a new message from James again. Saffron was an important Valencian spice, which obviously paella think about. Does its aroma feature much in Catalan literature, saffron?
Oh, in literature, I'm not sure, but saffron is going to be part of my my book. I'm interested in saffron and sort of the way that saffron and the flor de azahar, right, as well as sort of Spanish leather have these accords, right? Notes and accords have been part of the orientalization of Spain, right? And so I want to dig deeper into the histories of these fragrances, but also how those fragrances have been sort of mobilized for that, not only the way that Spain orientalizes its past and it's sort of the Arab world where a lot of these spices came from, but from without as well, how Spain has been marked by their associations with these certain accords.
Right. Okay, good. I'd look forward to the paella at the next presentation then, that you could be part of that. Okay, I mean, I think some people want to eat now or smell different things as well as drink. We'll leave it there, and thank you again for a great talk. And
thank you very much.
With nice smells as well as taste emerging, and visual images that make us want to go or return to certain places. As Shello has written, una memorable experiencia intelectual y sensorial, which is a nice way of doing that. So you can put your thank yous in, but also put emojis and your applause in visually, which of course is another transsensory way of approaching this. And I thank you personally as well for the lead up as well as the actual lecture that you've given us. And we look forward to reading the book when it comes out, but I hope it's going to come out with some smelling files or something as part of the.
I've been sourcing scent cards. Yes.
Great, fantastic. It'll be part of it, as opposed to these boring CDs or DVDs that come up the back with all the data. It will be a bit more interesting. So thank you again, and we wish you a pleasant afternoon in Toronto.
Take care.
And thank you to the audience for taking part with some great comments in the chat.
All right. Bye-bye.
All right.